choice of music, Dr. Cook. I'm loving it.
That's a groove to it, you know. It's an afternoon song. People have been probably working and taking in some of the summit offerings today. It's all async except this part.
Yeah. Great music to wrap up the workday for sure.
People slowly trickling in through the virtual door. Cool if we were in person with one another, but we're virtually live.
Yeah. Well, how's the weather in Minnesota right now?
Gross. It was hailing, not just like snow, it's the worst. It just hailed. So like rain that hurts. Basically.
Oh, it's sunny here in Southern California. Super sunny.
Sunny and what?
Sunny and about 70, so we're doing nice. No rain in the forecast.
Well, we're going to give it another minute and then we'll get going for kind of our capstone to day one of the Not Your Typical MTSS Summit. Take a little time with some Q&A, share a resource, and we'll, hopefully wrap up this day one and create some excitement for day two, which will focus on tier two, that intermediary level of support. We know we have students who have needs in addition to tier one, really important level of care that schools work to get up and running. Well, let's use that as a nice way to segue into this time. I'll introduce myself and then hand it over to my partner in crime here. My name is Clay Cook. I'm the Chief Development Officer at Character Strong. Spent a lot of time working with school systems around MTSS work and have failed in partnership of schools with school systems and through that failure, identifying things that we got to get right. If we stand a chance at implementing MTSS, so each and every student's able to access the experiences and supports they need, there's a lot to get right in order to improve student outcomes. That's why we called it the Not Your Typical MTSS Summit. We didn't want to just talk about the key concepts. We want to explore things that make this work difficult and complex. Even though it's difficult and complex, it's the right work because we're striving to make sure all students get their needs met. And we got to figure out what's going wrong in order to get it right. And I'm here with Felisha Santiago, who's our Director of MTSS, and she'll take it from here.
Yes. Welcome, everybody. We're so excited that you joined us for our Not Your Typical MTSS Summit. Definitely different from what we're usually used to, and just having the normal MTSS Summit. But we, like Dr. Cook said, we want to get ahead of those problems. So what are some problems that we see with implementing Tier 1? In the chat, we just want to get to know who's here with us today. Where are you joining us from, and what's your primary role that you're playing either on your campus or the district office? So go ahead and put that into the chat. I shared earlier, I'm from Southern California. It's nice and sunny here. And Dr. Cook, where are you from?
I currently reside in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm a California native, but in the better part of the state of California, Northern California. Oh, Gig Harbor. Nice.
Oh, we have a school counselor from Washington.
Ohio School for the Deaf. I used to partner and work with the Louisiana School for the Deaf for 3 years. That was really meaningful work. Gordon, hello. How are you? From Hawaii.
We have a Southern California here too.
British Columbia, Canada. Nice.
All over. We have some Spokane Valley.
Renee. Renee's someone we collaborate with very closely.
Yeah, and Camarillo. Well, we hope you enjoyed looking at those interviews and our different panelists for the Tier 1. You heard from Dr. Kent McIntosh, Dr. Danny Kim, Keith Bowney, Dr. Nicole Holland-Sims, and Chris Moore. In case you missed one, they were all very, very great interviews and share some great insights and some problems that they have faced as they've implemented Tier 1. So if you've missed any, don't worry. The benefit of the MTSS Summit is that it's recorded, so you can watch it at a time that works best for you.
So we wanted to do a little bit of time travel. This is Tier 1 time travel. And in the spirit of a Q&A to get some discussion going, what we want you to do is imagine you hop in a time machine and you fast forward 3 years from now, and all the energy and effort you put into Tier 1 resulted in successful implementation that led to better and more equitable outcomes for students. Now, here's the reflection point. Based on what educators have control over, what needed to happen over those 3 years for successful implementation and better student outcomes to come about? What had to happen in order to get Tier 1 implementation right? So if you can, in the chat, share your ideas on over the course of those 3 years to get Tier 1 robustly implemented with success and in a way that ultimately resulted in better outcomes for students. We call that ROI, return on investment. You got that return on investment. What needed to happen? Felisha, based on your work, you know, across levels, beginning in the building, moving from the building to do district level work, what are some of the things that you know need to happen in order to get this Tier 1 work right?
Well, we definitely had to be crystal clear and have an idea on what is the outcome, what is the ultimate goal that we're looking for all of our students, and backwards mapping from that outcome, really identifying this is where we want to get. Now, what are all the things we have to do to get there? So that was definitely our starting point to make sure that we saw those changes in student outcomes that we were looking for. And I see some great comments in the chat too that are saying some of the same things: common language and consistency, common language and understanding of SEL competencies. I love Dr. Tasha Gibson says professional development. I love that one.
Yeah, that clarity piece begins with the outcome. Then we calibrate the practices to produce that outcome. But then we need high quality professional development to help people get good at implementing the core practices that lead to the outcome. And so all of that, as we start to create crystal clarity in the supports we're going to provide around a core set of practices that we've selected and honed in on, and we have a high degree of confidence, if we can get these implemented over time and students receive prolonged exposure to them, that's going to make the difference. That's when outcomes are going to come about. And the system needs to stay the course in that process versus, you know, the next flashy thing comes up and the system ends up pivoting and shape shifting on people. So we like to think about the purpose of Tier 1. If you can in the chat, this is more of a Tier 1 formula to how we think about it. But what are the purposes of Tier 1? So what is Tier 1 supposed to achieve and accomplish? If you can't share your thoughts there, but we tend to define Tier 1 from this kind of formula. It's for every kid. All kids get it. It has to address students' holistic needs. It's not just about doing academics louder, although we need high quality core academic practices that lead to outcomes. And it's about all hands on deck. Tier 1 means all students. Tier 1 has implications for all the adults, all the fingerprinted people who routinely show up daily and consistently. They have a role to play in implementing Tier 1. So if you can in the chat, what are some of the purposes that you see to Tier 1? One, I will just cheat and say Tier 1, we often think from a MTSS is about prevention. So if you believe in prevention, you gotta believe in Tier 1, because that investment in Tier 1 is an investment in prevention. But what other purposes does a really robust Tier 1 system of support play? What comes to your mind, Felisha?
Well, Tier 1, definitely one of the key pieces you said is prevention. And it's really giving us that stepping ground, that foundation to really identify what kiddos are going to need some Tier 2 and some Tier 3 support. So looking at our solid Tier 1, if we have every component in place at the Tier 1 level that I know The kiddos where tier 1 is just falling flat for, they're going to need additional support. So tier 1 really is identifying and giving us that pre-picture on who might need some tier 2 and tier 3 support.
So we're going to move us along here. We like to use a baking metaphor, and Felisha is going to walk us through this. This is how we conceptualize what goes into tier 1. And so I'll let Felisha take it from here, but we probably overuse this metaphor at Character Strong to really start to operationalize what we mean by tier 1.
Yeah, so when we look at tier 1, we're looking at it as a baking metaphor. So I'm a mom of 2. I like to cook for my kiddos. If I'm going to make them chocolate chip cookies, I need to know, 1, what is the recipe? 2, what are those ingredients that go into the recipe? And we do the same thing for tier 1. What is it that we're trying to get accomplished in tier 1? And what are those different ingredients that are really going to drive together and mesh together to give us those outcomes that we're looking for? So when we look at our tier 1 recipe, we know that our ultimate outcome for students is that 1, there's a sense of well-being, a sense of belonging, and sense of engagement. So these are our ultimate outcomes. This would be my chocolate chip cookie if I was baking in the kitchen right now. But what are those ingredients that are going to get us those outcomes? 1, we need positive relationships with our kiddos. We need some type of relational practices on our campuses so that students feel that sense of belonging and that sense of engagement. We need opportunities for empowerment. We also need our environment. We need a safe, predictable learning environment for our kiddos. And then we need to focus on our teaching and learning effective practices and making sure that those practices are usable and effective. And Dr. Cook's going to dive into that a little bit later today.
Yeah, I mean, which of these ingredients do you think are essential to get to the outcomes we want for young people? If you think about, which one, where's the investments need to be in order to produce the outcomes to the right?
Yeah, investments, we always say relationships. Everything starts with those relationships and builds on up from there. And Lori in the chat said relationships as well.
Yeah, and the question is, do we have a core set of tier 1 practices that represent shared language and dedicated behaviors that we're all going to come together as a community of educators and invest in implementing daily and consistently in order to bring that ingredient to life? So we see often in many schools, we have out of one side of our mouth, we're talking about the virtues of relationships, but when it comes to a core set of practices, we don't necessarily have a core set of practices we're implementing as a community of educators to bring that ingredient to life. So we're missing an ingredient. And then we also see some schools go all in on a single ingredient and expecting the outcomes. That's like going all in on a flour and expecting a chocolate chip cookie. You're not going to get the chocolate chip cookie. You're just going to chew on flour. And has anybody just eaten flour? It doesn't taste that good by itself. But when it's combined with other ingredients, flour is incredibly delicious. If you have eggs, brown sugar, and mix it all together to create this delicious thing. So at Character Strong, we tend to think about it from a recipe standpoint, not just a single ingredient. What we need to do is use these ingredients to then form the selection of a core set of practices. It was said in the chat already, I saw the word clarity mentioned. To get implementation right, going in the right direction, we have to start from a place of shared clarity. Shared clarity means we're all in the same boat, rowing in the same direction. And so we tend to think about clarity as being necessary but insufficient alone to get to successful implementation of tier 1. In the chat, what happens when we don't have clarity? What happens when a group of adults come together and they have deep values to make a difference in kids' lives, but they don't have shared clarity? What happens when there's a lack of clarity among adults who come together in the service of better outcomes for kids? What comes to mind for you, Felisha, when you've seen in your own work trying to do systems change work and you realize we haven't provided enough support for our adults to reach that clarity? What starts to happen when that shared clarity is not intact?
Adults start to get confused, they start to get frustrated, and then potentially what we're trying to implement isn't getting implemented at all.
Yeah, chaos. Let's just state, we get chaos among the adults. And sometimes, yeah, people are getting frustrated with one another because people are working against one another's efforts sometimes. Oh, the siloing and the fragmentation that can happen. So we use a boat metaphor when we think about the starting place for tier one is always shared clarity and commitment. People need to be clear, but then they need to be clear, committed to the thing they're clear about. Because I could be clear, but I'm like, no, thank you. I have crystal clarity actually, but I'm not going to actually row in the same direction. So here's how we think about it. Yeah, everyone needs to get in the same outcomes boat. Felicia mentioned it earlier. Start with that outcome. What is the outcome we're trying to achieve and produce on purpose? So are we all in the same outcomes boat? So there's their shared clarity there. The next thing is, are we holding the same rows? Those are the practices. So we're all in the same boat. Now we have these shared practices around how we're going to produce that outcome. And then being willing to use the paddles and row in the same direction to achieve the outcome is the commitment. So a lot of the work we're doing around tier one is really trying to create shared clarity and commitment. And then we start to align our professional development. And our professional development helps people start to get competent and confident in their ability to row with those paddles. So we start to increase the probability of getting to the outcome. But even when people get good, we actually have to put supports in place to help them be consistent in their follow through over time. Now, here's how we think about core tier one practices. Okay, we got outcomes we want to achieve for kids. Now we got to select really good practices. Those practices need to be both usable and effective. There's two truisms. Unusable practices are overly burdensome to implement and nearly impossible to sustain. A lot of systems will invest in practices. Ultimately, they're too clunky and they won't be able to sustain over time. It's also true that ineffective practices will not produce benefit even if they're implemented well. So essentially, core tier one practices where we start to get clarity, we have to have key ingredients. We need to select core, usable, and effective practices that we can afford, that are feasible and clear, we can support the implementation of, but they also need to be effective. How do we know? We should have some degree of evidence. If we put them in place, that it gives us confidence that it'll produce the intended effect, and they're appropriate, both from a developmental and culturally responsive standpoint. So that's how we think about kind of getting tier one right at the beginning, is shared clarity and commitment. But that work begins with identifying the outcomes, getting in the same boat, selecting usable and effective practices, and now building supports to cultivate commitment, and then competence and consistency along the way. We have a resource we want to share with you, and it has here what we call our clarity checklist. It's on the tier one, we call it the tier one rubric. This clarity checklist you can use with your staff to really start to assess, do we have shared clarity and commitment around our core tier one practices? And if so, then how do we then move beyond clarity and commitment and start supporting people's competence and confidence to implement those practices really, really well and continuously improve over time, so more students access high quality experiences and support? So that's a rubric we're going to leave you with. Here's another question I want to tee up. What are the biggest struggles you have with tier one that you know you have to solve for? I call them torpedoes. Torpedoes are things that will sink the most well-intended implementation efforts. Because they're a torpedo, we have to solve for them in order to get implementation right. So Felisha, I'm going to turn to you. Others, I would encourage you to share in the chat. Based on your work at the district level, what are some of the biggest struggles that you encountered around tier one that you had to solve for? You had to put it out in front and figure out how are we going to overcome this, or it will sink our effort.
Yeah, one of the biggest one was implementation overload, having so many thingies on our plates that everybody became overloaded. And then what happens? We become frustrated and we don't see true implementation and true fidelity of the work we're trying to implement. So one key one, implementation overload. I see Sonia says admin support. That's another one.
Yeah, building level leadership is going to be the linchpin. And it's the building level leaders that work with and through others in their building to put the systems of support their adults need in order to establish shared clarity. Once you have clarity, move beyond that to building competence and confidence, and ultimately put the systems in place that help people consistently follow through. How many of you, it resonates with you that we're going to have to, one of the biggest barriers we need to solve for is clarity, competence, and consistency. We like, if our people are unclear, we're gonna have a tough go at getting to outcomes. What is one way in which you supported getting clarity, Felisha?
Oh, definitely having a plan. So just like you shared, that fidelity rubric is, let's figure out what are those outcomes that we're going to do, and let's get crystal clear on how we're going to get to those outcomes. But we first had to identify where are some of our gaps, where are we doing really well, and just feeding off of that and identifying our next steps from there.
Yeah, de-implementation is, we also call it pruning. When you have implementation overload, it's like a tree that just needs your help. You got to prune to get relief. We go in a lot of systems that are bloated implementation wise, and there is a need for de-implementation. One question to answer is there a human on the planet that can actually implement everything that they're expected to do and integrate? That's why that core selection of that selection of core practices, it has to be manageable and feasible, and we can't overwhelm the adults along the way, because if we overwhelm the adults, ultimately students don't receive. And when students don't receive those core tier 1 experiences, we're unable to move the needle on outcomes of interest. So we're going to end with this Q&A. We're here we'll answer as best as possible some tier 1 questions if you have them. If you have any questions more generally about how we've organized the Not Your Typical MTSS Summit, please make those known to us. And if you have questions about your life in general, Felisha's here. And she will answer every question about your life, because she is a Rolodex of just answers for life.
I love it. We do have a question in the chat. They want to know, what is Character Strong offer for continued professional development?
Yeah, there's a menu of professional learning, professional development supports. One of our flagship ones is called the School Culture Training, and we can probably share some resources in that. And that is really about school and classroom culture and climate, but also around core effective practices that we organize around something we call the SERVE model, which means start intentionally, engage relationally, respond with empathy, values practice consistently, and exit intentionally. It's a core set of practices. And then we have specific training around our curriculum, our tier 1 curriculum. That's really pre-K through 12 social, emotional, and character education curriculum. And those are kind of our flagship professional learning experiences. And then we provide a range of support around more of implementation. How do we get implementation right? And really working with leadership and teams to build implementation capacity in order to put in place the supports the adults need in order to continuously improve to get to those student outcomes.
Another question, Dr. Cook, how do we deal with our goal of meeting the needs of all students, but not having the resources to do so? And before you answer, Dr. Cook, Gordon, I think you should have some pizza for lunch. You could never go wrong with pizza.
That's awesome, Gordon. Yeah, this is, I mean, how do we want to meet the needs of all students, and how do we, with the resources we have? We often do resource mapping and capacity and figure out, with the resources we have, how much can we actually take on at any given time, and what are the outcomes we can expect to achieve. This isn't like a strategic plan where we make lofty claims and ultimately we can't support the implementation of those core set of practices. So it's really about beginning with a resource map that resource map aligning to the types of student outcomes, then going and identifying what practices can we actually support the implementation of over time in terms of an infrastructure, based on what we can create for infrastructure with professional learning, being able to monitor fidelity and give feedback, provide coaching supports if necessary. Like, how much can we actually support as a system based on the resources we have, versus keep adding on and layering on and getting that implementation overload and ultimately overwhelming people along the way and not getting to outcome. Yeah, the hexagon tool is one tool that can be used to sift through and select core effective practices. We have an inventory we can share, and we'll make sure we share out on the back end of this. And it's just, what are usability criteria and what are effectiveness criteria? You use those criteria when vetting core practices that you want to select for tier 1. But there are some helpful instruments like the hexagon tool where you can go and kind of develop profiles on practices to make sure that when you make a selection decision, you're selecting usable and effective practices. Because what you don't want to select is an effective practice that ultimately isn't usable because you can't sustain it, or a really usable practice that's not effective.
Another question, Dr. Cook, where do you recommend to find evidence-based MTSS family engagement practices?
Yeah, this is one in which you want to strategically partner with people who know how to look at the scientific research base and start to identify the core set of family engagement practices with the highest amount of evidence. So, we like to think about MTSS isn't just for students, like we build a continuum of care for students. MTSS can be used for any human. Like, we can use the multi-tiered framework to think about what are tier 1 family-focused practices that each and every family can anticipate receiving from us. What about families who may need an additional level of support? What can we activate and provide as support for them? And a few of our families are going to need more intensive support from us. And what does it look like in terms of the supports we provide? So we did an intervention, a family-focused one. It's called Parental Wise Feedback. And it was just sending parents two-way communication, but it had what we call wise message about children that were positive and fulfilling, identifying the characteristics and qualities we really appreciated about them. But there was often an ask to ask parents to also engage and support their child's performance at school. And when you loaded those messages and invited them to do something back, significantly more parents responded to that because of the intentional messaging about their child. So there's two-way communication is a core set of family-focused practices. We also know things as simple as positive notes home are just on a routine, disciplined way can be really effective ways to incorporate tier 1 practices. And then from a culture standpoint, make sure all families can see there's representation. They can see themselves in the school environment, see that it's valued and appreciated, and it becomes a more inclusive environment for all students and families.
Right. And so we have about 2 minutes left. If you have any questions remaining, go ahead and put those in the chat so that we can get them answered for you. And yep, it looks like you're welcome, Bren.
Yeah, so there's one just on kind of mental health needs of students, and then trying to invest in tier 1 work, which makes it can make it challenging. So here's how we tend to approach this work in supporting school systems. If you just do tier 1 work, we all know tier 1's the foundation, but we see a lot of people kick the tier 2 and tier 3 can down the road until tier 1's in place. And ultimately there are students, even though those kind of weaknesses in tier 1 will make it look like there's going to be way more students who look like they need intervention than actually need an intervention. They just need tier 1. We can't just wait to do good tier 2 and tier 3 work. So we need to move on both fronts to really think about how do we continuously and incrementally our base foundational supports, and also work often with people playing different roles in the system to start to put in place tier 2 and tier 3 supports for students who have needs that go above and beyond, and they need support in addition to tier 1. Because until that happens, a lot of people will just feel like, oh, this MTSS is about just teachers changing in their roles. Nobody else is actually changing their roles to make available certain services. And so that's how we tend to approach it, recognizing there are students who are really struggling with mental health needs, and how do we begin to activate higher quality supports while also doing really substantive, meaningful, focused, and feasible tier 1 work to increase the foundation of supports.
All right, so it looks like we're right at that 3 o'clock, Dr. Cook.
Yeah, thank you all. We appreciate you showing up. If you can, we know time's scarce, but tomorrow's going to be a great menu of presentations on the topic of tier 2. We'll have another capstone to that day. We'll have a Q&A on tier 2. But yeah, we invite you to join us for the remainder of the days, and thank you for plugging into the Not Your Typical MTSS Summit.
Thank you all. Have a great evening.